Joining me this morning, my guest is Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator. He's joining me live via Skype. And Joseph is also a professor at Jacksonville State University, where he teaches forensics. So, Joseph, I have to ask you, being part of a university system, knowing how things work there, we know that parents will go to many lengths to give their children a leg up, to pay for additional tutors, to pay for expensive college consultants, to get them involved in every extracurricular activity under the sun, because that's just how competitive it is today to get into top schools. But when you heard about this, were you surprised about the lengths that these parents went to, making up these lies or paying someone to make up these lies and cheat on tests for their children? I mean, paying as much as $500,000? Or were you surprised to hear that?
Yeah, I was, Stacey. One of the things here is the depth of the deceit. You got multiple layers of fraud that are going on. Just everything else aside, just think about going in and falsifying, these tests with the ACT and the SAT. And one other disturbing fact about this that I've picked up along the way, apparently in some of these cases, parents were urged to have their kids, listed as being disabled.
Right,
that is,
learning
they
disabilities.
need an extended period of time to take a test. I deal with this in classes with kids that have disabilities and legitimate disabilities. These kids have every advantage in the world, as we all know. Their lives are broadcast. I think one of these kids even has a very popular YouTube channel. It's very, very disturbing when you think about everybody that struggles just to get into college and just to do the work. All these kids that are student athletes, I see them all the time, that are they go without sleep many days, show up and take a test, and then go out to practice. It's kind of very, very sad commentary.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. What you were referencing, the disabilities, I know there was one case in which an executive, had his child pretend to have a learning disability so that he could get 2 days to take a standardized test. 2 days in which the person that was proctoring the test was either giving him the answers or going back and changing his answers after. So for sure, a lot of dishonesty. But Joseph, what about the fact that there were university, college employees, these sports coaches involved in this? I mean, the head of one head coach at Yale being paid $400,000 to say that someone was a recruit. I mean, okay, parents will go to any length. These are people that have every means at their disposal. But what do you think about the coaches taking these bribes?
Well, you have to think of it this way. The administrators might try to distance themselves from this event. I don't know if there's direct linkage with administrations and everything, but those coaches represent the university. You think about Stanford, you think about Yale. They actually, they're salesmen for the university relative to sports and the programs they're trying to attract top athletes. So de facto, they are part of the university. So there is an awareness there, at least at some level. And I think that, the hammer is going to fall on a lot of people here moving forward. And this thing is, I'm interested as it moves forward through the courts to see how extensive this network is that reaches out. How many other parents are involved? Because the parents have to take the action, right? In order to start this deceit moving forward, you got a guy that's offering to do it, but the parents have to take that step. So It's going to be very interesting to follow.
Yeah, and investigators did say that there could be more indictments down the road. There were people across 6 different states charged in this. And my last question for you, Joseph, is the universities here, I mean, look, even the prosecutors are saying the kids, the students in these cases didn't know what was going on. Their parents were kind of doing this behind their back. But what happens? I mean, the schools, some of these students are probably, sophomore, junior, seniors. The schools aren't going to, kick them out at this point, I would assume. I mean, what is your thought? I mean, they're already in, they're studying. Do you think there was any consequence for the student, now that these universities know that they were fraudulently admitted?
No, I don't think so. I think that would open up an entirely different can of worms from a liability perspective. The only way these children are going to be dismissed from a university is they're failing to meet academic standards, or any other number of reasons, they're not, in my opinion at least, they're not going to be, they're a revenue stream, okay? And if they're not breaking the rules, they're going to be there. So I just can't see them being cast aside in that.
My guest this morning, again, is Joseph Scott Morgan, who's a forensic death investigator. And Joseph, this is essentially your bread and butter, I know, forensics. This is what you teach, and this is what you know so well. And I want to just bring up something that the prosecutor said in the opening statement, which is that the medical examiner would testify that in all the cases he's ever had involving dismembered bodies, they were always homicides. The cause of death was always homicide. Do you think that that is necessarily the case, that these two always go hand in hand?
Yeah, I've never seen anybody panic in a case where you have some kind of natural event that occurs and then they proceed to dismember bodies to dispose of them. And it almost sounds like some type of Hollywood narrative device. It's in every case that I've ever worked of dismemberment in New Orleans and Atlanta, there was homicide involved. It's the idea of trying to get rid of the evidence, the corpus delicti. You want it out. You want to get it dispersed. And sometimes that's a problem for the perpetrator, because then they wind up creating more evidence. And in this case, I can tell you what you're going to hear is that there is a bounty of evidence that will have connectivity to it. So that'll be interesting to watch. Tool mark experts might be involved in this case, and you're going to have the anthropologist, particularly maybe from the ME's office, and of course the forensic pathologist. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, yeah, we will hear about a lot of other evidence. There were blood splatters on the cart that Jimmy Scandirito bought to transport the body. There were other human remains found in a suitcase that presumably had held his father's body at one point. So right. I would think it's, as you really referenced, especially hard to clean up any trace of a crime like this when you have something as messy as dismemberment.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this, Stacey, is the fact, a lot of people might not understand what's involved in here. If this is a butchering of another human being, and if anyone's ever been to a butcher shop, you know that they have specialized tools. You would have to have specialized tools. You'd have to have time. You'd have to have a location where you can do this in secret, so that you're not going to draw attention to anybody. I'd be interested to know what they find at this apartment that he talked about, that drugs were so spread apart. Did he go into the bathroom and do this in the bathtub, like we've seen in several cases over the years? Or did he have a workshop somewhere where he would go and facilitate this? And then we've got this issue of transfer of biological evidence to the instruments. Were they effectively cleaned? Did the police recover any of these? So there's a myriad of evidence that's going to go. This is going to be fascinating and compelling court testimony. I guarantee it in this case.
So again, this is gruesome, disturbing stuff. And my next question for you, Joseph, is kind of about the psychology. Because, okay, if you're going to, as we just talked about, you're going to dismember a body, that is a messy, messy undertaking, and it is really hard to clean up the evidence. Now, the defense is saying he loved his father, they had a great relationship. He just panicked after his father died doing drugs, so he cut up the body. But, I mean, when you have a dismemberment case, I mean, I would think that is, if you really indeed love your father, love the dead body, I mean, that's especially hard to do. You're desecrating a corpse. I mean, I guess it's not that it's any better, but it's one thing to ditch a body in the river or something like that, but to actually cut apart someone's body in that way, I mean, what's sort of the psychology behind that?
I can't speak specifically to the psychology. I think probably from a behavioral standpoint, the individual that's doing this is, they're literally ripping their parent to pieces, and there's no delicate way to put it. So, in my estimation, there would be a lot of anger involved that would help you shield your mind to the point where you could facilitate it. We talk about things like overkill many times when someone has, the individual is obviously dead, and then they continue to do harm, if you will, to the corpse, multiple stabbings, multiple gunshot wounds. I've seen many of these instances where corpses are in fact desecrated, and this is a desecration of corpse. So I think that it lends itself. I don't know. It's interesting how they've come to this point, Stacey, where they're talking about the compassion and the love that he has for his dad. but yet he admits that he dismembered his father. So that's very, very difficult to do.
Yeah, and it's almost a little bit difficult to believe if he really did love his father, have this close relationship. You know, they both were mourning the death of his mother, of Skip's wife, from just a year ago. But we're going to hear a lot more of that as the trial progresses. And by the way, I should note, it's not just first-degree murder that James Jimmy Scandirito is facing. It's also abuse of a dead human body. I mean, that is also a serious criminal charge there. Now, the testimony here that we just heard is Gary talking about Skip's health, because the story from the defense team is that Skip was not in very good health. He had heart problems. He had an episode 2 days before his death that Gary thought was almost like a stroke. This serves to sort of bolster the defense's argument that, look, he died of natural causes. Do you agree with that, Joseph?
Well, you know, he's talking about the nausea. Sometimes, you know, if an individual is having what's referred to as a myocardial infarction, commonly known as an MI, otherwise known as a heart attack, sometimes there will be sudden onset nausea. But most of the time, if it is a sustained event, that nausea is not necessarily going to pass. It'll just continue on. So I don't know. I don't know where he was getting the idea of stroke, if maybe he was, you know, very, very dizzy or whatever the case might be. But one of the problems here is this. We're not going to know if he had a stroke because we can't find his head.
Right. It's a little hard to do an autopsy, right?
Hopefully, yeah. What they'll have at autopsy is the heart. And it was in at least good enough condition so when the pathologist dissected it, they could tell whether or not Skip had an MI, you know, in the recent past. Now he's already had, I think they said, triple bypass surgery.
Right.
And I'm really curious. I'm really curious as to how smoking marijuana, if that's what they did engage in, impacted his heart disease, because there are some indicators that that can bring on an MI in certain cases.
All right, so we're listening to the crime scene investigator there discussing, her name is Mary Cassandra, discussing how she processed the scene. She took 249 pictures, and she keeps talking about blue star testing, this blue star testing that was done. Joseph, just in the most basic terms, explain to our viewers once again, what is blue star testing? What is she actually referring to when she talks about this process?
Blue star is actually a chemical solution that can be mixed up at the scene and then applied to a specific area to detect whether or not blood has been present at that scene, even in cases where an individual has attempted to clean the area. You can appreciate things like big swipes where people might use a paper towel or, you know, footprints or anything like that that have been previously attempted. It's a new generation luminol is what it comes down to.
And just like from the logistics perspective, for people who, you know, don't know that much about crime scene processing, is this like a liquid that's spread on the surface and then shows signs of blood? You know, I'm thinking like a black light, right? You turn on the black light and you can see all these things you couldn't see in regular light. Is this, you know, what is the process of using the blue star to see where the blood spatterings are?
It has to be mixed appropriately first off, and then it's applied. It's placed into a sprayer, and then you essentially go over the area. Just think about spraying some type of house cleaner.
Okay.
You're spraying it over an area to apply it over the area, and then it will in fact luminesce after that. And she has to have this camera set up. This is very important in a manual setting, so she can set the shutter speed and the exposure so that she can capture this image, because this is going to transfer. Hopefully they'll show some images right in court of what she's done here.
So the witness, Mary Cassandra, is now showing a box where she says some reddish-brown stains were discovered. So, of course, you might think, oh, that's blood. In fact, that's what went through my head. But our forensic investigator, Joseph Scott Morgan, says actually it's a lot more complicated than that. Right, Joseph?
Yeah, it is. You cannot just look at a stain and say that that is, in fact, blood. That's why they're using this terminology of red-brown staining. You have to do a presumptive test at the scene. It's a very quick test, and they look at it, and if it tests positive, the earliest one of these tests is called the Kastle-Meyer test. It goes back to the turn of the last century to determine if, in fact, blood is present. And then you heard her remark at that point in time, once she had determined that the red-brown stains were, in fact, blood, she used 2 swabs to collect a wet swab and a dry swab to collect evidence for DNA testing further. So, the whole idea is to try to narrow this thing down, identify what it is, if it is in fact blood, and then with the DNA, find out whose blood it is. So that's where we are.